I think this is probably the single biggest beat up area of all of the media discourse around like the threat of China to Australia. This actually fucking shocked me when I was doing research into this. So China is the 8th biggest investor into Australia. It has, I think, about $70 billion invested here. It's behind Luxembourg, it's behind Singapore, it's behind Belgium.
Probably a lot of the fear is when people look completely different. Like you just look completely different, you know what I mean? And realistic, like let's be real, whether it's a good thing or not, that's how the human brain works. When you see people buying all your stuff and they look nothing like you, then you're like, bro, what's going on?
Yeah.
Hey boys, before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, today's episode is sponsored by Manscaped. Listen, I'm being legit here. I've been using the Lawnmower 4.0 since I first talked about it. I use it all the time. It's gun, trust me. It doesn't cut you, doesn't graze you. I don't know how they've done it. It's got a little light on it. It's wireless. It can go in the water. It's a gun razor, trust me. But hey, it comes in packs. They got these little packages. Listen, right? Ball toner, ball deodorant. You might have a giggle, but trust me, your balls need to be toned and they need to be deodorized, right? It's legit, it's a given, it's a no-brainer. Anyway, I've got a deal for you. You use code THESEARCH, 20% off. Listen to this, 20% off and free shipping. Use the code THESEARCH. That's it, tell them I sent ya. Lawnmower 4.0, best ball clipper there is. You can use it any way you want. Anyway, let's go.
All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Search. Listen, today we're going to talk about a very interesting and relevant topic of China. Our guest is a writer and researcher focusing on world history, geopolitics, and an expert on US-China relations. He's written regularly in the international affairs, politics and cultural issues in the ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald, including covering the US nuclear build-up in the New York Times. He's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for International Security Studies at the University of Sydney. Dr. Stuart Rollo, welcome to The Search.
Hey, man.
Brother.
I'm good.
What a bunch of mouthfuls
I know, that was very impressive.
Only one stutter. What about that? Hey, how are you? Well, you good?
Yeah, I'm really good.
I'm excited for this, bruh. Let's go just straight off the bat. The rise of China. Where does it start and why is it so important?
I think it's important because it's this is a really epochal moment in world history. So for probably the last 400 or 500 years, there's been a ebb and flow of empires and they've all been European. So sort of speaking in the last 70 or so years, there's been an American empire. The United States became the most powerful country in the world after World War II, and it basically designed the whole international system that has, dictated terms of economics, politics, military affairs, this kind of thing. And China is the first non-European country since, probably going back to the Ottoman Empire, that has been, that is going to come to be, a really influential shaper of world affairs.
And also a superpower now is completely different to a superpower of 500 years ago.
Yeah, or if you rule, the digital communication system, if you can, have great influence over the internet, you completely, set the terms by which everyone comes to information and processes.
And bro,
it's way more powerful.
Even how you said that, even from what we know, look straight into it, bro. From what we know of the way that China, how China are with that type of stuff, even in their own country. It's very different to the way we are.
It's pretty interesting, man. I don't know, there are all this way that China sort of governs itself. As we said, it's completely different. I suppose the fear that we have isn't so much about what they do. It's this idea that they're going to shape the world around that, and that's eventually going to be imposed on us. I guess the big question is, to what extent does the rest of the world, democratic countries, to what extent will they be in a position to counterbalance China or to have their own, approach to these things? I think that a big thing about the rise of China is that we sort of conceptualize it as like, okay, well, America rules the world now, and so when China becomes the most powerful country or the biggest economy, they're going to rule the world in the same way America does. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's true. I think like when America came to power at the end of World War II, it was under this completely unprecedented set of circumstances. Yeah. So, at the end of every other major power is obliterated, or they're the Soviet Union. It's I suppose Britain wasn't obliterated, but it was just so much less important after World War II than before. So at the end of World War II, you have Europe decimated. Japan is a vassal of the United States.
Most of Asia is decimated.
Exactly, yeah. China loses 20 million people in World War II. So the US sits at the helm of creating this new world order, and it has half the world's economy, more than half the world's manufacturing power. I think like 70% of the world's gold reserves. Yeah. It's the only country with a nuclear bomb. By far the biggest air force, the most developed. All of this, Navy. And by far the biggest Navy in the world. So it had this unprecedented disparity of power between it and everyone else. So it really could just do whatever it wanted, to a certain extent. I don't think that's the position China's in now, and I don't foresee it ever getting to that position outside of a really catastrophic war that it just comes out as the last man standing on. Exactly. And that
really
sort of world, it's just such a terrifying hypothetical. I don't think that what we're going to be dealing with is that sort of China that's so powerful in the same way the US was, that it can dictate, how everyone else uses the internet, what everyone else's political system is. Exactly. There is, of course, always a risk that like a powerful country is going to seek to reshape the world in ways that are favorable to itself. But I do think
Do you think they want to do that though?
For the whole history of empires, they almost all, well, maybe not almost all, but it's very common for them to say, we have no real imperial ambition. Yeah. We are going to be a power that sort of breaks the cycle of empires and will bring, equality. And so China's approach traditionally has been this sort of third worldist narrative. It's that, there is this imperial core of Europe and North America, and we represent the third world, the other countries, the undeveloped world, and we're going to be a leader of that type of, that sector of the international community and champion the sort of culture and approaches of that world. So I think China does, there certainly is like a principles of like what a Chinese order will look like, and the way they frame it now is actually very much around sovereignty. So because they're so obsessed with Taiwan, for example, and this idea that Taiwan is a part of China, they just say like, and because they commit various human rights abuses in their own country, their idea is like, well, you just have to respect the national sovereignty of everyone else. So if they actually were to stand by that, then that would imply that we don't have that much to worry about them shaping our internal affairs.
It's easy to say that.
Exactly, yeah.
What country won't say that when they're not the biggest power?
Exactly.
You can't say it when you're not the biggest power. When you're second or third in the list, you can't really tell everyone that you're going to take them over. Yeah. You sort of have to play that card.
You'd think that. I mean, the US, since, the United States declared the Monroe Doctrine in the 1820s, which is that like...
Oh, really?
Yeah, so they said no European power is allowed to do anything in the Americas or will take it as an act of aggression. And they justified this through this idea of American exceptionalism. So that because the old European empires are sort of authoritarian monarchies... that repress their own people. We are a democracy and we're going to bring democratic values to the rest of the world.
It's the new world.
Yeah. So they said this at a time where they had no navy, a fraction of the economies of the European powers. So I do think...
There was nothing in 1820, really.
Yeah, well, they were on the rise, but it wasn't for 80 years until they became like the biggest industrial power.
Yeah.
But America had this like very missionary ideology at the core of their empire building. It was very expansionist. It was this idea that we're going to reshape the world. We hold within us through our democratic institutions like a model of better governance for the world. I don't think China thinks that now. I'd be pretty surprised if even behind closed doors they were sort of planning, we need to create one party capitalist sort of state capitalist organs of power in every country to in the same way that the US sort of decided they were going to institute democracy everywhere. So I think they won't have the power to do that on anything like the same level as the US has had, and B, I don't think they're ideologically committed to reshaping the world in the same way that the United States was.
How do you see their power, their physical power? How do you see it like?
So, like in a total aggregate scale, they're nowhere near America is far more militarily powerful than China. So I think the US has 10,000 nuclear weapons. China has about 500. The US has a much bigger navy.
Submarines.
Their tech is also like about a whole generation more advanced than China. So all their missile systems, all of these are more advanced and accurate. They're better with the sort of digital connection of everything. But if you're talking about like an actual war that's going to happen between the US and China, it's not going to be all of America's military
Total
assets
war.
Exactly. And you'd hope that it wouldn't be a nuclear exchange. So they've done like heaps of since the sort of 2010s, which was when America really put its attention on China. And, so Obama came to Australia in, I think it was 2011, and announced the pivot to Asia, which was this idea that like, we've been distracted by these, destructive, wasteful wars in the Middle East. We're going to pivot to Asia, where the real major threat to...
Oh, really?
Yeah. The real major threat to America is for the rest of the century, which is China. So he came here, announced that. They recalibrated their like naval assets to have more in the Pacific than were here before. So since that has happened, there've been like, places like the RAND Corporation, which is like a military think tank in America, have done war games and studies of like what would happen in an actual war in the Western Pacific, which is where the fighting would be. So it doesn't really matter what forces America has stationed in Germany or Africa or whatever. It's about like what forces they have at their disposal in the Pacific and what China can muster there. And so obviously in the Western Pacific, this is right off the coast of China. So China has a huge advantage there. It can use, ground-based missile launch systems to attack American ships or whatever. And they've actually...
their ports are there.
Exactly, yeah. They've got port access. They can replenish supplies way quicker.
Their aircraft from airfields on mainland China.
Exactly, super important. So in the studies that have been done of that, they've progressively shown year on year that like the US is quite unlikely to win a limited conflict in that region. So when you think of it in that scale, like China, it can't challenge American global military power, but it certainly is starting to be able to contest that region, which is really what China cares about now.
And here we're specifically talking about the South China Sea,
pretty much,
Taiwan. What's China's attitude towards Japan? They got something there's a lot of history there.
And understandably. So I'm sure your listeners...
Japan are very imperial over China throughout history, right? They like even you see from old films, like Japanese people are really like in their mind we're better than Chinese. You know what I mean?
It was they had a complete well-developed ideology around that it was Japan's mission to build the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which was Japan's words for a Japanese empire where we're at the top and everyone else is subordinated to us.
And they've done a lot of bad stuff in China.
Yeah, man. It was shocking.
And it wasn't that long ago.
No, it was living memory. Honestly, this is really important to remember. Like, when we talk about, how much of a threat is China to Australia, it's completely hypothetical. We've never had a conflict with them. We were actually on their side in World War II.
We were.
In
America liberated China from the Japanese.
Whereas when you're talking about, China and Japan, it's not hypothetical. Japan colonized China, invaded it, and killed, I think, 20 million people there in living memory. So, I mean, I'm sure they have... The interesting... it's so funny when you go to, like... This isn't exactly on this, but, like, I went to Vietnam a few years ago and was talking to people about this kind of thing, and I totally expected that, like, Vietnamese would really resent America.
Yeah.
Because even
I've heard this.
sooner.
I know what you're going to say.
Exactly.
They're like Americans
they love
spin
America.
out. Americans spin out. That was only 40 years ago.
Yeah, man.
And it was the most vicious, ruthless war that has ever taken place. It was worse than World War II.
Yeah,
like
more munitions were dropped on Vietnam.
And the way that people were murdered was just really savage.
Yeah,
and like,
totally like destroyed the society.
poison,
destroyed
like
the countryside.
what's that spray they sprayed?
Agent Orange.
Agent Orange. Kids are born defected all over Vietnam.
Yeah,
and
and you see
here,
them everywhere. It's really tragic.
Yeah, you go one generation later, and they don't
like
talk
it.
bad about America.
No, they like it.
Yeah,
and
that's so crazy.
I know, it really spun me out. And they were like...
It says a lot about them, man. That says a lot of good.
I know.
Like,
Definitely. I think the Vietnamese people are super resilient.
Yeah.
And, good-hearted. But, you know, I use it as an example because I suspect, you know, I'm not Chinese and I don't speak Mandarin either, so I don't know my finger's not that much on the pulse of what Chinese sing. But I suspect that it's not what we would expect, their idea of Japan. I think that they, you know, in many ways, at least up until recently, have taken some inspiration from Japan as like a rapid industrializer, a country, an Asian nation that was the first to stand up and be powerful in and of itself against, you know, Western imperialism. So I'm not sure that there's definitely deep-seated resentment for sure, but I think there's probably some other sort of complex relational things that I just don't get.
Yeah. What about the Chinese people's view on their own government? How is that? Like, because that's something we barely see.
Yeah.
Even the Chinese people that are in other countries, they're like, they talk like they know what's going on, bro. You know what I mean? They say things, they say the right things. You feel like they're saying the right things because over in China, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, do you know what about their attitude? What's going on with them? Because there's crazy stuff going on there, bro. There is. Like, regardless of whether their intentions is to do it to the rest of us, there's crazy stuff going on there. What's with the Uyghur? What is it? They got over 1 million people in concentration camps.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. The like numbers are quite disputed. I think they've built enough re-education camps to...
I love that word, re-education camps.
Yeah, well, we call them that. I think they call them vocational training centres.
Yeah. This is such a scary word.
Yeah. Yeah, it's terrifying. But so what's going on over there is, I mean, I think China is committing all sorts of human rights abuses.
And who are these people? Who are the
So
Uyghur?
they're an ethnic minority in Western China.
Yep.
So China is dominated by the Han ethnic group that make up like 95% of the population, and they're along the sort of, they're eastern, central, southern China.
Yep.
Then you have Xinjiang.
Over the mountain regions out west?
Yeah, I don't know. It might be mountainous. I actually don't know. Definitely Tibet, which is another, you know, traditionally at various times independent region. So these, like Xinjiang and Tibet, have throughout history sort of, when Chinese empire has been strong, they've been part of China. When it's retracted and grown weak, they've been independent.
Okay.
So after World War II, after the Chinese Civil War, which the communists won in 1949, they started putting like Han Chinese labor camps. So they were moving Han Chinese out to Xinjiang, basically as a form of internal colonization and development. And they've...
Is that to lock that part in? Is this like, we're sick of you coming and going, we're locking that in, we're sending our people there,
absolutely.
They're going to start building?
Yeah, and part of that is, it's not just that we go and colonize it and develop it and incorporate it into the Chinese economy. It's also that we basically see as a threat any sort of nationalistic independence, unique cultural practices. So I think they're doing, what in a relatively short time frame, what other settler colonies have all done. So you go into a country, we've done it here, take over a country, either genocide the population, which has happened throughout, Western colonies, or you do an aggressive program of assimilation.
Or colonies, really. Even third worlds, they do that.
Exactly. Yeah. So, they're trying to turn Uyghur people into good citizens of the Chinese state and economy with their loyalty to Beijing, not to Islam, not to their own cultural practices,
they hate
not
religion.
to their own communities. They do seem to hate religion, don't they?
That's the basis of it. I think that's the basis you got to there, is that they're Muslim, and they can't handle that citizens of their own country would look at something above them. They do the same thing with Christians.
They definitely, exactly. They see it as like a dual allegiance. You have they're very focused on having allegiance straight to China, to the nation state, to the party.
And there's no other God.
Anything else, anything else is a threat to that. I think they see it as that.
They're still doing that stuff to Christians as well, eh? It doesn't get talked to as much, but like they shut down all the churches. They kill and threaten to kill religious leaders, even Christian ones. Yeah, you know much about that?
No, I don't.
Yeah,
I know a little bit about the Falun Gong stuff, but no, I know that sort of oppression of Christians happens, but no, I don't know the details.
Yeah, fine. What's going on with the social credit system? This is a very new thing. How long has that been going on? What exactly is it? Yeah,
well, I think it was 2014 or the early 2010s at some time they announced like, oh yeah, we're building this social credit system. I think it's quite misunderstood in the West, and I think this is an area where the Western media has just immediately jumped on like, oh, China's doing something. It's, the most horrible possible interpretation of it.
Scariest thing in the world.
So it is like, on a conceptual level, I think it's pretty terrifying. Like, there's some centralized rating system that's completely opaque to you, so you don't really know at what instance your credit's going up or down, and you're at the whims of some bureaucrat or some algorithm deciding you're either good or bad, and that's going to have implications for whether
your participation in things.
Exactly. So it's really, really bad on a conceptual level, I think, to have this sort of centralized rating of individuals in a society.
Is it up and functioning?
Not fully, no. Not fully. So it's actually quite disaggregated. So there'll be like regions that have social credit systems and big government, state-owned organization, enterprises, this kind of thing. But the aim is to unify them all.
Me personally, I find that scary as. So they're watching you down to polluting, watching your performance at work. Is it gambling, alcohol?
I don't know about that. I haven't read that.
And so they're putting a score. They're giving you a score that allows you to go in or out of things, including public transport. Have I got this right?
Yeah. So I think I'm not sure if it's all public transport. I think it's like that if you're blacklisted, then I think you can't take fast trains between the major cities. I think that they basically want to keep you in a certain area. I'm not sure if that's the same as like you can't take a bus in the city or whatever. But this is a subject, like I remember when this sort of hit the news in a big way, it was probably like 2018 or something, and we'd talk about it. I'd like raise it in my class, and I had heaps of Chinese students at Sydney Uni. And it's pretty interesting, like what you said earlier about how like Chinese people here in general won't, like there is, like fucking Australians are just so happy to criticize absolutely anything about the government. Like there's no worries about that.
You jump on your Instagram and then, what's our Prime Minister's name? Scott Morrison?
Albo. The X one.
Albo, whatever. Anyone will run him down.
Exactly.
Kick his head in, blah, blah, like it's nothing.
So they're very much not like that. And yeah, and you do like it's pretty striking, honestly, when you like you're having a conversation about, you know, any aspect of international relations, politics, whatever, and you can just sense that like when you bring up something critical of China, there's just way less engagement with it. And I don't think people are scared. So you asked earlier, like, how do Chinese people view their government? The government's incredibly popular. They have something like 90 to 95% approval. The central government.
That's what they say.
No, that's what I thought as well. But I read a Harvard review, a study done in America.
Done in America?
Yeah.
All right, well, it's a bit more. I thought like they're going to go around, got some military guys going around China with do you like us or not? Tick the right box, mate.
Yeah,
See,
no, that's...
And the other 5%, don't worry about them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think the difference is the probably 5 to 10% that don't approve are really getting fucked over by the government there in such a huge way. But no, it is like by Western polling, Western research methodology, it's really, really popular, the central government. But there's a sort of inversion between our approval of government in the West and Chinese. So here we generally have super low approval ratings of federal government. So now Biden in America is fucking 34% or something approval, really? Super low. But we have really high approval of our local government. Yep. So here, like when, you know, if it's council, generally you poll people and it's like 80% approve of what the council's doing, and then like 30-40% might approve of the federal government. Whereas in China, it's like huge amount. I do think, I mean, it's hard to imagine 90% of people actually approving of a government. It has to be inflated, you'd think. Yeah. But whatever it is actually, it's highly approved of. Yeah. But they hate their local governments.
Really?
So, yeah, and there's this weird relationship where, and I think this is part of, you know, probably both the structure of the politics there and also the propaganda, the communications to the people, which is that whenever there's a problem, it's put on local government, and the central government is the one that's seen as the one that solves it.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, they'll have a corruption this is why when Xi Jinping came into power, his big thing was like, I'm clamping down on corruption, and corruption is rampant or was rampant in China. And that was actually part of why they started the social credit system.
Oh, really?
So the vast majority of the actual penalties imposed by the social credit system are on businesses. They're not on individual people. Yeah. So it was set up, you know, the Chinese government's rationale for it was that we have this low trust society where there's lots of corruption, all sorts of, you know, problems that mean that our society doesn't run efficiently. You can't trust businesses, blah, blah, blah. So there's all these problems, and the central government comes along and says, okay, we're going to, you know, imprison all these corrupt officials. And of course, they imprison the ones that aren't sort of within their own power networks. There's still plenty of corruption there. Yeah. Politicians in China are extraordinarily wealthy.
Really?
Yeah. But yeah, there's this sort of dynamic they've got over there that we don't really have, which is that the central government is seen as the political organ that solves problems, and it's the local governments that are the corrupt that fuck up. Whereas here we see everything that happens, we mostly rightly, in my opinion, blame Scott Morrison, for example. But like, you know, who knows what else is going on that's...
And another thing going along with what you said, the approval of them, I guess they would have to be very happy to the position that their central government has got them, even to be talked about like this, because 40 years ago is nothing.
Yeah.
I'm almost 40. I'm 36. Just before I was born, they were peasants.
Yeah.
They
were like peasants. Literally.
And now they got a central government, and everyone, you know what I mean? Like the pride, they love seeing their government talk strong. It's like how Russians must love seeing the real patriotic Russians must love seeing Putin just stand up and go, fuck you all, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And of course, so they love that fact that in 40 years, in one lifetime, they're getting talked about like, are they the threat to the world? America's worried about them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. It's a
super. Person.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point.
They'll be, you know what I mean? Like, you got to understand, like, just the ego of every human. They'd be trotting around the earth with a different, like, holding themselves higher. Yeah, we're China. We're diplomats from China.
Yeah.
You know, don't mess with
and
us.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, and even on that sort of personal level, like, Do you remember when we were kids, like the sort of status Chinese tourists had compared to now? Like if Chinese tourists weren't, you know, it was Japanese tourists that were like coming, had the money, blah, blah, blah. You never even thought about Chinese tourists. They would be like, oh, someone's coming here to, you know, work or something like that. Whereas now they come here, they have all the money.
Tourists.
Yeah, and it just flipped like that. It's pretty crazy.
Bro, I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
I do remember that Japanese tourists.
Yeah.
You go, the Gold Coast is full of Japanese spending money.
Exactly.
Here, Japanese. You go to the Gap out at Vaucluse, where we are, and it's Japanese tourists. And you're right, it's Chinese.
Yeah.
All big with big bundles coming
they
everywhere,
got the money.
buying everything.
Yeah, exactly.
What about this? What about that? What about the whole thing that, and you can't say they're not because they are, Chinese people just going and buying everything. That's an active thing, right?
Depends what you mean. So like as in their consumer goods, they have the money.
No, like buying properties everywhere in Africa, the Middle East, they're trying to buy everything. Like, is this a full plan, or is it just they got all this money all of a sudden and they don't like being in China?
They definitely, yeah, I think that kind of is what it is. It's not about necessarily not liking it, but what happens in any sort of developing economy is they end up, especially a export-oriented economy, right? So China has made all of its money from exporting goods to the rest of the world, not through consumption in its own country.
Yeah.
It's now building a bigger consumer market. Like it's now the second biggest, might even be getting bigger than America now.
Yeah.
But traditionally it's been, we make money by selling shit to other countries. What happens then is you accumulate huge amounts of foreign currency reserves, which China has. It has trillions of dollars in US currency, and that needs to go and be productive somewhere else. So this is like a, basic sort of facet of imperialism, is that you have overproduction and underconsumption. And when you have those two things, the money has to go elsewhere and find foreign markets to develop and to continue growing from. So China's in that phase. The US has, that's what the US created a global market after World War II. The whole history of American empire has been laser focused on the China market. That was always seen as, America. If you read, congressional debates or sort of letters of correspondences between politicians, whatever, in the 19th century, Americans are completely obsessed with this idea that like our domestic economy is reaching its sort of its boundaries.
Yep.
We need foreign markets. We need other places to sell American goods and to put American capital. And that was always focused on China. So they established this thing called the open door policy in China, which was this program by which they said other European powers can't colonize China. It can't just become another colony of someone or split up. We have to all be able to access it. We all have to be able to benefit from Chinese labor. We all have to be able to move our money into China.
Yeah.
So this is how empires work.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. Now with the Belt and Road Initiative, with all of the mining operations and everything going on in Africa, China's doing the same thing. It's building an international network of economic activity whereby, all sorts of benefits are certainly accrued in these places.
Yeah.
But there are also environmental costs, and ultimately the money flows back to benefit China.
Hey, do they still see themselves as communists though? Like saying all that, there's Chinese people with millions of dollars. It's like, how does that? Are they communist or they're just?
No. They're state capitalists.
Yeah.
So, but there's a big difference between how capitalism works in China and how it works in the West.
Yep.
So I think that the West has, progressively over the last 200 or 300 years become what you call a market society. So where the interests of capital come to suffuse every aspect and dominate every aspect. So money dictates politics here. It dictates, society. It dictates how we consume things, how we relate to each other. It's complete. All of this is subsumed by your position in the market, I think.
Yeah.
Whereas in China, that's true to an almost equal extent, and even in many ways they are more consumeristic, I think, than is common in the West. But the party still is the ultimate.
What do you mean by that? They're more consumer.
Well, like I was chatting to a Chinese mate a little while ago, and I was, this was this was, I think, after the fucking bushfires here or something, and I was just, reflecting on how this period of just like massive environmental destruction doesn't sort of spark something in us to change how we live and how we consume, then nothing will. And I was like, like when is it like this in China? Is there any hope that China will be less bad than we in the West are and just wantonly destroying the planet?
No way.
He was like, dude, it's so much better here. He's
No
like,
way.
he was like, go to China and see it. And I think from everything I've seen, he's right. That
What about Taiwan, bro? Taiwan. They're not stopping till they get it. They're not
I don't
stopping
think
till
so.
they get it, right?
Yeah.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah, I think
It's gonna
so.
happen. Do you think that that somebody will fight a war with them over it? Are we just trying to deter them as much as possible? Or do you think we'll actually fight a war with them for it?
I hope we don't fight a war for it. I think that going to war over Taiwan would...
Because they're not stopping.
No, they're not going to...
They've said it too many times.
Yeah. So, what I think a lot of people don't realize about Taiwan is that... So the origins of Taiwan as a sort of... as being separate from China. So Taiwan was part of China for several centuries. Then Japan, there's this war in 1895, I think it was, between Japan and China.
Yep.
Japan takes Taiwan. Then Taiwan's colonized by Japan until World War II. Eventually, Chinese take it back after the war.
There's even the Dutch in there.
Yeah, and Portuguese, I think, too.
Portuguese
Yeah,
too,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So before... Yeah, and so it wasn't... I didn't know that until pretty recently, that it wasn't even Chinese until the 1600s.
Yeah.
It was Dutch and
it was
Portuguese
Dutch,
first. Yeah, that's funny. And of course, indigenous.
Indigenous too.
Yeah.
They have their own indigenous people there as well. Yeah.
But yeah, so China has the civil war. The nationalists are defeated by the communists and they flee to Taiwan. But when that happens, neither side, and the nationalists, the Kuomintang, are the government in Taiwan for the vast majority of the last 80 years.
Yeah.
But neither side says that Taiwan is a different country. It's just that they disagree over who. They're like, we're both one China, but the communists say the government of that China is in Beijing. The nationalists say, no, we're the government of China, the whole of China, and we're in Taipei.
Okay.
So neither side says that it's a separate country.
Wait a minute. So the government, the nationalists, the government of the last 80 years in Taipei see themselves as the government of the entire China.
As the legitimate government of China.
So there's little Taiwan looking to take over China. Actually, it's the other way around.
Well, that was the idea for the first few years. I think they quickly
Have they let go of that?
You'd hope
Sure,
so.
it'd be
They
smart.
can't be that delusional.
Yeah, right. Just if I was them, I'd just say, all right, look, you can have China, but just leave us alone now. This is our country.
Well, yeah, I think that's what they actually want now.
Yeah.
In Taiwan, except because of this position of a one China policy, which was accepted by America. So if, for example, that the US recognizes that there's only one China and Taiwan's part of China. They don't know. Yeah, so and the Australian government too. None of us, very few countries, it's mostly sort of very small Pacific Island countries, I think, that recognize Taiwan as an independent country.
All right, because of the
of
history of the
because of
people.
I think honestly, I think it's because Taiwan gave them a lot of international aid in like the 60s. And
that helps.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, there you go. You can always buy friends.
Something. Yeah. But yeah, because of this history and because there's been all sorts of communication issued. So when the US wanted China on their side in the Cold War, in the 70s, they came to an agreement, we'll normalize relations with you. And part of China's terms for that, to sort of basically act as a balancing power against the Soviet Union, was like, okay, you have to recognize that we are the legitimate government of China. So up until then, Beijing wasn't in the UN. It was, So the China that was represented in all of the international institutions was Taiwan.
And why is it was Taiwan. I was about to ask that.
Yeah.
All right.
So anyway, there's this agreement that, okay, we recognize one China and it's in Beijing, but we also, both China and the rest of the world, agree that the goal is peaceful reunification. That it's illegitimate if there's, an attack, if it's a forceful retaking of Taiwan. And that's been the status quo for 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah. So I think...
So what's a peaceful reintegration then? So I can imagine being, if I'm Chinese in Beijing and I'm told that, 50 years later, it's like, all right then, peacefully integrate. What are you doing?
Well, I think that is what they expect. Yeah. I think they see it as similar to what happened with Hong Kong.
Yeah.
That ultimately there's going to be this gradual... Well, I mean, in Hong Kong, they knew that it was going to revert to Chinese.
Countdown, yeah.
Exactly. So there were all sorts of...
but how did that work out for Hong Kong? You know much about that?
Yeah, look, I think, I don't think most Hong Kong people want to be part of Greater China. But...
That was 100 years, right? Since the Opium Wars or something like that?
Yeah.
That long ago? The war with the British in the 1800s?
Yeah, so the Opium Wars there was one in the 1840s, I think, and one in the 1870s or 1860s. Yeah. I think you're right that it was a 99-year lease with Hong Kong, so that wouldn't have been from then, but they definitely had, it was a treaty, what they called a treaty port in the 19th century, so there were all sorts of rights that the Western powers had there. Yep. And then I imagine, look, to be honest, I don't know about the exact agreement that sort of ceded Hong Kong to Britain in whole, but I think it was, 100 years ago.
Is it coming to, with Taiwan, more of a boiling point than it's ever been? Is this getting progressively more aggressive as time goes? Or is it the same as it was 20 years ago? Why are we talking about it a lot more?
Well, a Chinese would say that we're talking about it a lot more because the US is starting, so the last, Nancy Pelosi just went over there. That's why it's sort of in the news at the moment. Yeah.
Okay,
so the Speaker of the House, probably the second most powerful person in American politics, just visited Taiwan. And whenever something like that happens, China's like, well, you said that we're the legitimate government. Why are you going to this, what we see as a breakaway region? So I think that is heightening tensions, obviously. But I don't think, looking at it objectively, I think it's seen as getting more and more important now because China's getting more and more powerful. So, in 96, I think there was another Taiwan crisis. So I think there was an election and there was a candidate that China didn't approve of that had some sort of had indicated that they would seek independence. Yep. And in response to that election, China fired missiles into the sea, not onto Taiwan. And in response to that, the US sailed aircraft carriers through the Straits of Taiwan, just sort of demonstrating this power. So I think that was probably more intense than what's happening now. But the difference is China couldn't do anything then. Yeah. If America had wanted to, defend Taiwan, then they would have. And they could have, whereas now I don't think that's the case. So I think people are more worried about it now because the balance of power in that region has shifted so much.
And that has a lot to do with, because it's a major pathway for the ships, right? Why do we care so much?
About Taiwan or the South China Sea?
About both. Aren't they really related?
Well, they're separate.
Taiwan is very, is that like a powerful move for the South China Sea?
It would be, yeah. So basically we care about it so much because the United States has pushed its security perimeter to Asia, right? So the US has about a network of about 200 bases along what they call island chains that go from Korea down through Japan, Guam, Marianas, Philippines, Singapore, Australia, Hawaii, all through the Pacific. They have all these bases. And China quite rightly feels besieged by this, that there's only one country these bases are set up there for. They're not there to stop the Philippines from attacking everyone. They're for China. Exactly. So there's this massive imbalance of...
It's sort of how Russia feels on the other side
with NATO Europe. Expansion, exactly. And in the West we have all these ideas that we're the good people, so why would anyone ever care if we're... Of course we have a right to have 200 bases around another country.
Even when you say it like that, it's funny.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? That we do think like that.
Absolutely.
Like,
It wouldn't even occur to us to think that could be a bad thing.
Even on
It's a good thing if we're
on the other
powerful.
side of China, it's full of American bases.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And that was, that's a big concern for them as well. And they're concerned about, this new push for the US to get close to India. So India has traditionally been a non-aligned country. And it was actually much closer to the Soviet Union than the US during the Cold War.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but now we're building a new alliance, the Quad, with Australia, India, US, Japan. The only target of that is China.
Oh, are we?
Yeah. So we're trying to get
They're getting powerful in the eye. They're big
much
country,
more
big
powerful.
economy.
Yeah, much more powerful.
Not like China, but
no,
like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think
They're a player.
Yeah, oh for sure. Yeah, and they're a nuclear power.
Yeah.
And it's pretty funny actually. In the Cold War, the US was closer to Pakistan. And if you remember, like at the beginning of the War on Terror, the US was operating bases in Pakistan. Yeah. But now Pakistan has shifted to be basically an ally of China, and there's massive political turmoil in Pakistan now about all of this. So this like shift of power is really sort of reorienting a lot of politics, in countries around the region.
Because they got their own thing going on there, right? Pakistan, India.
Yeah. And honestly, that might be more dangerous than any of this shit.
I
Seriously.
hear that a lot. I hear that that's, if you want to put anywhere the tipping point of a big war, it's like right on that border.
Yeah.
People say that a lot.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
What about, bro? I know we touched on it, but and it was like we fought nothing. Like China is buying Australian things. It's a big topic here. From the most common person to people in the government talking about it. You go to any auction in Sydney, it's full of Chinese people.
Yeah, like just the
For real,
housing market. I live in Zetland, man. I see.
But Zetland's full of China. Zetland's Chinatown.
Yeah, pretty much.
Everywhere's Chinatown. Let's be realistic. Like, is that a concern? Surely that's a concern. That's spoken amongst you and people at the uni and stuff like that.
Yeah. So this is something that I'm actually really like. I think this is probably the single biggest beat up area of all of the media discourse around like the threat of China to Australia. So I mean, for example, the US has much more money invested in the property market in Australia than China does. We just don't see it. You don't notice, like, if there's some American at an auction, you probably don't notice. Whereas if they're Chinese, everyone's like, oh, it's another Chinese person buying something. Not to say that obviously, it's self-evident there are heaps of Chinese buying property here. But when you look at it on a bigger scale and what matters, total investment in the economy, China is minuscule compared to the United States. And this actually fucking shocked me when I was doing research into this. So China is the 8th biggest investor into Australia. It has, I think, about $70 billion invested here. It's behind Luxembourg. It's behind Singapore. It's behind Belgium.
Behind Singapore.
Yeah. So literally Singapore owns more of the Australian economy than China does.
You said that because I was going to say, you say Luxembourg. If you're going to say like Western European nations in the United States, I think, like, let's be real, people here would be a lot more comfortable with that because we are descendants of those countries. We are, as Australian people, descendants of Western Europeans. And that's, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of us see those people as our people, or Americans as our cousins or our brothers who come from the same part of the world. And probably a lot of the fear is when people look completely different. Like, you just look completely different. You know what I mean? And realistic, like, let's be real, whether it's a good thing or not, that's how the human brain works. When you see people buying all your stuff and they look nothing like you, then you're like, bro, what's going on? Yeah. So, but until you said Singapore.
Yeah. So Singapore, and I'm pretty sure Japan is significantly higher than China as well.
Really?
Yeah. And there was a bit of a Japan scare back in the day as well.
Was there a Japan?
Yeah. So there was I mean, and you know, I remember my grandfather who fought in World War II.
Yeah.
He was so fucking disgusted when I brought sushi to his house one time.
Oh no!
And he said, but you know, his brother was in a Japanese concentration camp, so you know they had with Japan there was a very visceral these people were and we were taught that these people were beasts, killing and torturing our brothers in this war, and now we're buying it. Every car's Japanese. We're inviting them over here to invest. So I think that was probably more visceral in Australia. Whereas with the Chinese, I don't know. Like I said, like we've never had any conflict with them. Yeah. But you're right. You're 100% right that there is this total national psyche of like China is a threat.
Yeah.
And that goes back to the gold rush. I think like China that was this like then it was an immigration threat, right? Yep. So they found gold here. Heaps of Chinese began coming to Australia to mine in the gold fields.
How long ago is this?
1850.
Far out.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it was Chinese immigration that sort of gave rise to the White Australia policy. Because there were, for the first time in Australian history, large numbers of people that weren't European were coming here, it was seen as a threat. Both this idea of like, oh well, if more of them come, they're going to turn Australia Chinese. They're not going to respect our institutions. They're too different from us in the same way you're describing. And then there was also like this sort of more flagrantly racist idea of like, oh, because they were mostly men, it was like 90% Chinese men coming to work in the goldfields, barely any women. So there was this idea of like, oh, the Chinese men are going to come and despoil white womanhood, and we're going to become spoil. We're not going to have our racial purity kind of thing. So there's that idea of like this framing of China as a threat. So that was the first act passed by our parliament, banning non-Western migration, basically, with a particular eye to China. So I think it holds a lot of currency here, and people subconsciously are just we have a fear of, we see Chinese power as different to other power, more threatening in a way that I don't think is entirely rational. I think a lot of it's grounded in our own national sort of psyche, and to be honest, I think a lot of it's a projection of that. I think we Western European Australians on some fundamental level, even if a lot of us don't acknowledge it explicitly, I think a lot of us know, like, we came here and took this country from Indigenous people, and it was just because we were more powerful. We had no moral right to do this. And I think because we know that and we live that and we see that constantly, we think like, okay, well, what about when the next guy's more powerful than us? What's going to stop them from just coming and taking our country the same way we took it? And I think that's like really at the core of... No, I mean, there are legitimate concerns. I'm not saying like, oh, it's just a fantasy that China's powerful and like they could never do anything bad. Of course they could. But I think it's so, like you said, like there's that different ring to it with a country like China, which is populous and powerful and all these things, does have a lot to do with our history here.
Well, that's a really interesting point. That's a good point, right? All right, but what do you see like, how do you see the future of this? If I was to ask you, is China gonna become the world superpower, and when do you think that would happen? Is it as sure as everyone thinks it is?
I think it's pretty. I think barring a massive catastrophic war or some unforeseeable event, like look, what Americans have been banking on for ages is that China's going to break up, right? And I think that's why American policymakers are now really intent on like pushing Taiwan. So the idea, and there books come out about this all the time. There's this sort of bestseller called The Coming Collapse of China that was published like, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. And it keeps coming out with new editions updated by the author, who's this Chinese American scholar, who's like, oh, now actually, so initially it was like, oh, China's going to break up because the people of China are going to come to see the benefits of capitalism and democracy. And then the next time there's so much pollution, they're going to break up, and then it's so corrupt.
Then the next one.
Exactly. So the Western fantasy is that China's just going to fragment, and then there's no problem. Then there's no one really inside of America, and we can all go back to living under American empire. I don't think that's the case. I think China's really, really strong now and growing stronger. I don't think it will be, like I said earlier, I don't think it's going to be the superpower in the same way America was. But I think there's a few pathways. One is a world of competing rival spheres of influence, which unfortunately I think that's what's happening now, and I think that's what it's going to go. So there'll be an American sphere. America's really intent on keeping as much of the world in that as possible, and that would be Western Europe, Oceania, Latin America, and then there'll be a Eurasian sphere, which is, you know, China at the heart of it, Russia, Central Asia, Iran, and a lot of the conflict is going to be in Africa. I reckon, so it's really, when you look at what's going on in Africa, like you said earlier, China's building all of this infrastructure there. They're building mines, they're investing money. At the same time, America's just putting bases there. So the American military print in Africa has expanded like crazy in the same time that the Chinese economic print has.
America's putting bases there.
Yeah, and this is why. Yeah,
I just gotta laugh.
I know.
China's investing this and that.
Yeah.
America, they're just sending tanks.
Yeah, and the fucked up thing is, in our media, all you'll ever read about is the Chinese debt trap diplomacy, or the Chinese are building all these, you know, they're taking over these countries by lending them money or building their.
Do you worry about American pride though? Western
Absolutely,
pride,
I think.
Because, look, even from what we've just said here, China's not going to stand up against the West in a total war. They're not gonna. Even with their best friends, they're not gonna. They're not going to anytime soon. So America can sit there, and they do see themselves as the leaders of the world.
Yeah.
And this whole new world order has been set with that, hundreds of years in motion, going back from Europe since the 1600s. So what do they do at this point? Do they sit there and have, even you agree, well, look, if we sit here and we talk too much, China's just going to become more powerful than us. And we're going to be stuck in a world where we have to argue and we have to answer to someone. Or let's just get them. They love war.
Yeah.
Even in their streets, they love soldiers. They love in Australia, and we're very similar to America, but we don't have that war. Like, they're full warlords. Yeah. They're right down to the country home. They're warlords. Like, a soldier walks in the street of America, and people don't know this about America. They think it's just Middle East where they love war, North Africa, and the soldiers are. In America, you put that army suit on and you walk the streets, and people are like, step out your way. Yeah. You know, so there's a lot of pride there in their war and in their power. And that seems, from just what we said, to be maybe the bigger threat is American pride, to like, you know what, like the wrong president or the wrong, you know, back powers are in. And it's like, fuck this arguing. Yeah. Fuck this South China Sea. Let's just drill these idiots. Yeah. You know, and then it's on.
Yeah. And the funny thing, you know, the really I completely agree. I actually think that is the biggest threat to world peace now, is that I think that it is possible to come to a set of arrangements where there's, you know, inevitably there's going to be hostility. Inevitably China's going to be trying to expand its influence, and that's going to grate against America or Australia or anyone else. But it's possible if you have if America has a foreign policy based on deterrence and restraint and the capacity to sort of defend against Chinese aggression without having this obsession with total control. So they now have full spectrum dominance, this idea that like America has to dominate the sky, the sea, the space, the communications everywhere in the world. And if they keep trying to do, it's just a matter of, they're not going to be able to hold on to that. It's just impossible. So if you acknowledge that, then and you have this view you're describing, which I think is very scarily dominant in America. Maybe not dominant, but like it's a very powerful force. Then it's just, why are we wasting our time? They're going to be stronger in 5 years. They're going to be stronger in another 5 years.
Yeah, like you said, they're saying it now. You know they would. They're psychos over there.
A lot of them are.
They're psychos. Everyone we just see the Hollywood actors and the rappers and that. We see like, you know, the Crips and the Bloods. We think they're psychos. You don't know the normal American civilian. Like,
they have
in their heart.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting place, man, because in my field of, you know, academic study of this kind of thing, America actually has a way better developed like conception of, you know, a post-imperial foreign policy, right? So there are big think tanks, a lot of prominent academics, the most prominent in the country, who say like, we need to change, we need to stop having this view of a world empire where we control everything. We need to scale back. Whereas you don't really hear that in Australia. I mean, you do from normal people, but our sort of media and our think tank complex in this country is just like, whatever, we just need American power. America needs to be the most powerful.
Yeah.
And like that,
We
we're just going to work towards that. We're not even going to, and you know, it sort of makes sense because
It's
ultimately
understandable.
we don't matter. Well,
Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah.
We're not going to sit here in think tanks and make world-changing decisions.
Exactly.
It's
We
just
pretend we do.
Yeah, it's as far as the guys are we still friends with America? And I'm like, of course we are. What else are we going to do?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mad, brother. Thank you for coming on. Love that yarn, brother.
I had a really
Insights.
great time, man.
Thank you, brother. Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Nice to meet you.